Tēnā rā tātou katoa, ngā mihi kia koutou. My name is Hinemoana Baker, and I am a poet from Aotearoa, New Zealand. You probably know all this. My dad's side is Maori, my mum's side, she's English and German, her ancestry. And I come from four main tribes o iwi: Ngāti Raukawa ki te Tonga, Ngāti Toa Rangatira, the Atiawa, and down in the South Island, Kaitahu. I'm going to answer these amazing questions for you. The first question for me is about language and sound. In the poem If I Had to Sing, you describe language as a flute, a lily, an unsteady chair. In English, it's actually a chair overbalancing. And your work blends poetry, music, and performance. So how do Maori sonic traditions like karanga converse with your experiments in the German language or the English language? And does translation, as with my book Funkhaus, which has recently been translated into German and Polish, how does that transform or deepen the original rhythm or rhythms? So karanga is a form of calling which happens during formal ceremonies, usually ceremonies of welcome and rituals of encounter usually between a group of people who are local to that area and a group of visitors who are being brought onto the marae, or the traditional meeting area, tribal meeting area, sometimes for the first time. Karanga is a form of oratory rather than a sonic tradition. It's a form of speaking, but it's also a spiritual, it has a spiritual function in that it is a doorway for grief. Maori traditions hold the dead in high regard, and we don't see them as being gone or separate from us in the same ways as some other more Western traditions. So there's a complicated set of protocols around bringing the dead with us when we do these rituals, and karanga activates those protocols. And I guess mostly my experience with karanga, which is still very limited, because like many other people here, I didn't grow up with my traditions and my language. I've learned it all as an adult, mostly, and not mostly through my dad, because he was the generation where the language was kind of beaten out of them, and or it was taken. The traditions, the culture was in a lot of trouble in those times, kind of on purpose. You know, that's how empire works, or imperialism. So he was from that generation, and I've inherited that like many other people in my generation. It's changing now for generations to come. But when I've experienced performing karanga or doing karanga, calling karanga, or hearing it, being in the presence of karanga, the sounds are definitely part of the function that it fulfills, for me anyway. And I occasionally do use karanga in my performances, but only when it makes sense culturally. So I'm not going to be using that sound form or that kind of calling, vocal calling. I'm not going to be using that if I'm not in a language world that makes sense with that, i.e. a world of grief or loss, or communicating in some way with those who've gone before us. And in terms of the interaction with German or English, I I don't feel that if I'm working in German or if I'm working in English, I usually don't translate all of the Maori language at all. And this was an interesting discussion with my German translator particularly, but also a little bit with my Polish translator, that the Maori language needs to remain in Maori, kind of as a gesture towards the fact that it nearly disappeared. And one of the ways that it disappears still is through involuntarily being translated. So I occasionally, like my German translator and I worked particularly hard to find a compromise here, because it's also very important in the world of translation, in the world of literature, that people have access to what you're trying to say. So there would definitely be phrases and sentences and words that would make sense to be translated. So they'd have to go through English first, because I'm not a native speaker of German, and then into German or Polish. But there are certainly some phrases that I wouldn't offer for translation because of that spiritual significance, and also because there's always a tension with me between who owns this, who am I to offer any of this to anyone else in any way that takes it from where we have control over it as Maori. It doesn't belong to me individually, the language. And if I'm invoking those kinds of traditions, I'm very aware of the fact that it doesn't belong to me. Therefore, it's not my right to give it over without some fairly elaborate permissions. Yeah. So I hope that goes some way towards answering that first question. The second part of that question is, does translation transform or deepen the original rhythm? I guess musically, sonically. Very much so. German is a very different sounding language, so is Polish, so is English. Because I'm a native English speaker, I have my ways, my habits, I guess, my skills with performing in that language. Maori is not a native language to me. It's not a language I grew up speaking. I shouldn't actually use that phrase, native. It's not my first language. But it's a language that I learned in my 20s mostly, so it feels pretty comfortable to me. German is not that way for me. I learned it, and I feel comfortable to an extent speaking in it. But when I was performing with my translator Ulrika Almutsandig, mostly she would take the German role and speak the German language version in various different ways. We didn't ever structure it so that I speak the English and or Maori and then she just reads it straight up, because we found that a little bit dull. So we wove it a lot together. There were moments where we just we used gesture as well. Some of those gestures were echoing each other, some of them were not. We often improvised that. The gestures were very simple but hopefully profound, to make the show enjoyable and dynamic. But yeah, really, which language it's in obviously affects everything, including the way that it's received sonically, each poem. Yeah. So that's my answer to question 1 about language and sound. Kia ora no, hello again. So the second question is about body as territory. Your poems, Fossils and Tangihanga, animate objects like branches and buses and tie the body to urban rural landscapes. Is poetry for you an act of whakapapa, genealogy, stitching bones, land, and architecture together. And how did the image, "I'm a needle of bone on my auntie's knee," emerge? All very good questions. So, in terms of the tie between the body and landscape, yes, my poems do this frequently. Partly, I think, because it's very explicit in Maori culture that there is no difference, and I guess that's most overt in the fact that the word for land is whenua in Maori, and that's also the word for placenta, whenua. So when babies are born, we bury their whenua in the whenua. However, there's lots of other ways that I think of this sameness or this lack of separation. And yes, it is about whakapapa, because if you think about it, I mean, you can find this in memes on the internet. We're all only really borrowing the ingredients of ourselves from the earth and the sky. So all of the molecules that make us up right now have been in many other different forms, and they will be in many other different forms in the future. And the particular conglomeration of atoms that we are is just us standing up and looking around right now. I mean, philosophers and thinkers and poets over the centuries have said these things in different ways, much better ways. So, in a sense, there's no difference. It seems a little foolish to imply that there is. But I'm sure I do that a lot in my poems as well. And the image, "I'm a needle of bone on my auntie's knee," came about for two reasons. One is because bone for me is a very powerful word. Again, the word bone in Maori is iwi, and that also means tribe. So we often say about our relatives, "Oh, they're my bones," or "she's my bones." So that's why bone kind of became an important word and consideration for me in my first book, because it was about my bones. It's about my heritage. And I like the idea of a needle because it got across the ideas, many different ideas, a needle being something sharp, so it's not entirely comfortable, but that posture of a kid sitting on an adult's knee in a way which is not a relaxed or being comforted posture, but a way which is kind of vigilant and rigid. I wanted that image to accompany this poem because that rigidity and vigilance was part of my childhood. It's in my bones as well. Also, I like the multiple meanings of needles, and needles can also be, as Bill Manhire spoke about very generously about my first book, that it's like a compass, a needle and a compass. So a needle swaying between north, south, east, and west to kind of guide us to where we want to be or where we came from. So, yeah, that's my answer to question number 2. Kia ora no. So the third question here is about memory and violence. The poem Aunties catalogues women marked by pain, yet resilient. How do you decide which family stories to sculpt into poetry without reducing them to testimony? Is there an ethical line when reclaiming others' memories? So, in the first instance, I can answer that final part of the question and say, absolutely, there's an ethical line. I negotiate that line, or I navigate that line in many ways. One is that I remind myself that other people's stories are often also my story, the same stories. So I do have a right to tell them. However, other people who are involved in those stories don't necessarily have the right of reply because they're not writing and publishing books or performing these poems on stages for audiences. So I have to bear that in mind. A lot of the time people assume that everything in my poems is true and happened to me or happened to those named in the poems, like that all of those aunties are my aunties. Sorry about that. All of those aunties in the poems, in that poem, are not necessarily my individual aunties. They are sometimes a collage of different aunties into one character. Sometimes events in the poems are fictionalized in some way to disguise the true identity of people involved. I often use that. I also, if I do use names, it's only ever because I've checked with the people concerned that they are okay with having their names, their literal names or titles, in the poems. For example, my parents were both fine with it. All of the contents of my first and second book went past them first. I also make sure to, if I'm including somebody's story that I wasn't involved with, then it's doubly important to make sure that that person is okay with me including that story, and aware of the different ways that that might manifest. For example, performing is different to publishing because it does reach sometimes different people, sometimes a much wider audience, and in different countries, for example. So they need to understand the implications of what they're saying yes to. So far, all of that has been fine with me and my family and friends, but it is a line that everybody has to walk. And I'll answer the question number 4 about ecology and colonialism. In the poem Fossils, shareholders swallow buses, while fossils insist we are a branch of your family. So the question goes, do you see capitalism as antagonistic to Maori cosmologies? And how do you navigate the seismic trench between tradition and modernity? I definitely see capitalism as antagonistic to Maori cosmologies, but it's kind of an interesting question because in a way capitalism is antagonistic to every cosmology because it's not a spiritual practice or a spiritual tradition. It's a political ideology. So, but I guess the question is valid in that definitely we don't see our earth, Papatuanuku, or our sky, rangi nui, or the ocean, Tangaroa, any of our gods or our goddesses that are present with us here on earth, or that affect us or live with us here on earth. We don't see them as resources to be exploited for profit. We see them as relatives and we see them as ancestors. So that's what I was kind of talking about in my earlier answer. And so when the character or poetic voice in that poem, Fossils says, we are a branch of your family. We, the fossils, are a branch of your family. I mean that literally. And I don't necessarily see that there's a huge trench between tradition and modernity, at least for me personally, and probably for many Māori, because our traditions are being enacted constantly in our modern lives for exactly the same reasons and in the same ways and in the same language. So tradition is often kind of cast as something that's in the past. It's definitely not the case for us, even though there have been many efforts to ensure that it was, that the traditions or our cultural practices remained in the past, that they were exterminated, that we were exterminated, that our language was exterminated. So it's been a fight, but we are winning that fight. Tradition is also seen sometimes as something that's like antagonistic to, I guess, modern notions of human rights or cosmopolitanism, or things like gay rights, etc. This is often used in a homo-nationalism sense to justify the slaughter and genocide, for example, of people in Gaza. One of the things that Israel is doing is promoting itself as a bastion of queer rights. So much could be said about that, but that kind of homo-nationalism has no place in Māori culture. We were traditionally a very queer, positive culture, and any differences that have come about in those beliefs are the result of Christianity, as is the case, I think, a lot around the world for Indigenous peoples. So tradition and modernity for me are not two different things. Okay, tēnā anō tātou. So the final question, question 5, is about the sacred and the everyday. From yodeling to fish and chips for breakfast, your poems elevate the mundane to ritual. How does the spiritual, or the world of wairua in te reo Māori, manifest in daily gestures? What role does humour play in your vision of the sacred? So, complex question. The connection between the mundane and the ritualistic, for example. One of the main examples of this that I could give is to do with tapu and noa. Tapu and noa are the two kind of organising principles, spiritual principles of Māori life. And those of us who grew up with this knowledge, which doesn't include myself, I've learned it as an adult later in life, and I'm still learning. I think I will be till I die. Tapu refers to a state of being or activity which is limited by certain spiritual parameters, and noa is the release from those parameters. And I guess that might manifest in daily life in terms of, for example, in Māori culture, we consider food to be something which is not to be mixed with anything to do with the head. And there are lots of ways in our daily lives that those things manifest. But with reference to poetry, I think I'm a child of the generation that grew up reading Hone Tūwhare. He was our first Māori poet laureate, and he had an amazing facility with blending registers. He was a boilermaker by trade, and he had such skill in combining quite elevated literary language with everyday conversational idioms and rhythms. And I think I've absorbed that because I read so much of his work and admire him so much. And in terms of humour, I'd say that was the case as well, because he was a very funny man and a very funny writer. A lot of humour in his work. This particular example in this question refers to a line, the final line of Aunties. No, not, it's something like, it's not quite translated here, but it says, it's talking about yet another one of the aunties and how she plays piano and her pink fingernails click on the keys. And then I say, but no, she's gone now. I say no, but because she's gone now, but no, that one's your mum, silly, or something like that. So I'm saying, this is not yet another auntie. This is actually my mum that I'm remembering. And it's funny that it's received, I think maybe it's you, Trevor, who wrote the questions, as a humorous moment because of calling myself silly, maybe. But it's actually, when it's performed, it's quite sad because I'm remembering all of these aunties and there's quite a lot of humour throughout the poem, but that moment actually lands with quite a lot of sadness because my mum is gone. She passed away in 2018. And people get that. And it's a good example perhaps of how poems on the page work in a particular way that's different from how they might work when they're in the air. So, yeah, in general, I think a good work of art is one which is strung between tensions, or that uses the tension, or any kind of tension actually, to structure itself. So I think the contrast between humorous things and quite emotionally heavy things can really work on the page, and I try to use that as a writer. Not necessarily consciously, but perhaps myself as a performer is present in myself as a writer on that level. I'm envisaging how those things might land with an audience, those images or those sentences or those particular turns of phrase, rhythms, of meaning. And I value humour greatly. It is one of the sacred things in my life. And it's been an absolute lifesaver. I think I was saying to somebody else at some point that absurdity, in particular, absurd humour, is something I find really sustaining. Even that can't keep many of the horrors we see today at bay, but it's certainly been a lifeline for me in my life. So yeah, I do use humour a lot in my life and in my language, in my literature. So tēnā no tātou. Thank you for these amazing questions and for the opportunity to be involved in this amazing project. Kia ora.